Hey there, Panthers fans. It's Mike Kaye, Panthers beat reporter for the Charlotte Observer. I'm here with Alex Zietlow, and this is the latest edition of the Processing Blue podcast.
Woo!
Nothing's really going on in Charlotte right now, so we're going to have to will ourselves through this podcast. Clearly, I've got a really bad head cold. My head feels like it's being punched like every other moment. But I get to see Alex, so it's all not bad. Alex, how you doing today?
I'm good, man. Hey, I could tell you have a headache because you didn't somehow make your headache you didn't somehow segue that into some Panthers ineptitude phrase. I was really expecting something like, oh, he's getting beat up like Bryce was getting sacked last year or something like that. You're more of the analogy kind of guy, so I'll leave that to you. But I hope you're doing okay, man. I'm worried about you.
Well, I'm doing better than Bryce Young.
There we go. Here we go.
He's back. Let's get into this because the big news is that Shy Tuttle has a foot injury and he's being evaluated.
Mike, I was praying you made that joke. No joke. I was praying you made that joke.
So we hope that Shy Tuttle is okay and will be able to perform. But obviously the bigger news is that Bryce Young, the first overall pick in 2023, that was last year, by the way, has been benched for Andy Dalton, his bridge quarterback, or his supposed bridge quarterback, or should have been bridge quarterback, because that probably would have solved a lot of problems heading into this year. But I'll get into that later, and you want to stay tuned for this because I've got a lot to say about Bryce Young's benching. But I want to give Alex the floor first because I feel like I'm going to ramble and have a tirade, but more like thought-provoking than whatever Mel Kiper spurted out earlier today. Alex, what's your take on this Bryce Young situation and his benching?
I don't think that it came too soon. Let's start there. I think something needed to be done. I think the stats speak for themselves. I mean, through 2 games, Bryce was, I have them written down here, 31 of 56, 245 passing yards, 3 interceptions, no touchdowns, a total quarterback rating of 9.1, which I
That's a QBR. That's not his passer rating, just to clarify.
Okay, wait, this is actually a good time to clarify this. Mike, what is the distinction for those? I mean, I know what it is clearly, but what is the distinction?
A passer rating is the traditional passer rating that a player gets because of their completion percentage and all that stuff. A QBR factors in other analytics.
Okay. Still, 9.1, you never want to see a single digit.
Yeah. No.
That's not good. But if you're watching these games, those stats somehow don't capture his start. The offense that he's leading is bereft of life. I remember it clearly in the press box, there was one series toward the beginning of the game and they had gone through a couple 3-and-outs, and I audibly said, here comes 2 decent rushes up the middle and then a 3rd down incompletion. And it happened. It was one of 4 straight 3-and-outs that the Panthers started the game off with on Sunday against the Chargers. The 5th drive wasn't a 3-and-out because it only lasted 2 plays. One, a 10-yard run by Chuba Hubbard that was really quite impressive. And then the Panthers decided to go empty immediately after, and then Bryce throws an interception over the middle of the field. So that broke the 3-and-out streak, but it wasn't good, obviously. I don't think we need to illustrate that Bryce isn't playing well right now. I think when we answer the question, is Bryce being benched too soon? Is this move too soon? We need to consider 2 questions. And the first one is the season still salvageable? And what does salvageable mean? I don't think it ever meant playoffs. If you talk to the general manager, if you talk to the executive vice president of football operations, playoffs weren't the expectation. They even shied away from the word expectation. And you're 0-2 now. Since 2019, 0-2 teams have a 4.9 chance of making the playoffs. That's tiny, but the playoffs weren't the expectations for Carolina anyway. Another relevant stat via Bet Carolina. Since 2018, statistics show that the backup quarterback rarely plays better and rarely wins more than the starter does. The average starting win-loss difference is plus 0.022, and the average percentage pass completion difference is plus 0.2 or plus 2.75%. So that's all to say that having Andy Dalton in the backfield it is statistically unlikely that he will make this team a lot better. It is statistically unlikely that this season is salvageable when it comes to the playoffs. However, the playoffs aren't what the Panthers are using as a barometer for what makes the season good. How I consider whether this season is salvageable or not, the metrics that I would use are: did the team get better? Was there notable improvement on offense? Could they collect more data on Jonathan Mingo, on Xavier Legette, their first-round draft pick, who, by the way, wasn't targeted last week? Could the defense actually be good without constantly having to be on the field? And they were actually quite good on Sunday for a while until they eventually broke down because the Chargers' offensive rushing attack was so good, and they're built to break down barriers like this. So that's the first question. Is the season still salvageable? I think, considering the metrics of could this offense get better at this time? Yes. The second question, is Bryce still salvageable? And I'd love to hear your thoughts more on this, and I think that's probably where you're going to go with this. But is Bryce Young the number 1 overall pick in 2023? Is there a plan for him to get better in his time on the sideline? The one last thing I'll say about the only thing that I'll say about this before tossing to you is I had a friend of mine leave me a very long voice memo after the game. I'm sure a lot of people hit you up after the game too, but this guy's a huge Alabama fan, not necessarily a big Panthers fan, but a huge Alabama fan. And he contends that Bryce Young is the greatest quarterback to ever put on an Alabama uniform. But he's watched every snap that he's played in the NFL, and he doesn't recognize him. And I think that has a lot to do with confidence. You know what confidence can do to players in the NFL. You see it in Mac Jones. You saw it with Sam Darnold and Baker Mayfield, and you saw what happens when confidence gets infused back in them. Bryce Young doesn't have confidence right now. And as Robert Hunt said after the Chargers game, when you lose confidence in this league, it's very hard to get it back. He doesn't wish that on anyone. And so something had to be done. And I think that this is an adequate thing to consider, considering the badness of this first part of the season. I know I ran a little bit longer than you were expecting, but I think I needed to address those two questions. Mike, I'm going to give you the floor. Do you think this Bryce Young benching has come too soon?
In a cylinder, no. I mean, if you were just like, let's forget his draft status, let's forget that he's playing for a first-year head coach, let's forget all that stuff. Based on his play, absolutely. You couldn't evaluate anything here. But what I will say is this is the latest in a long line of mishandlings of this quarterback situation. And look, Sam Darnold's having a great resurgence in Minnesota. Baker Mayfield continues his resurgence in Tampa Bay. Let's throw that all out. Let's talk about Bryce Young, okay? Bryce Young was considered an outlier. He was considered a small quarterback who was phenomenal at the college level. You draft him. The theory was, at least from my perspective, that he was able to improvise and move around the pocket and make plays that other quarterbacks couldn't because of his processing speed, his elusiveness, and his accuracy. He also has a high release, which you thought could maybe help him overcome his size deficiencies. The league loved Bryce Young. There were multiple teams that wanted to draft him and trade up to draft him number 1. That is a fact.
Absolutely.
But the Panthers were the ones that pulled that trigger. They decided on him above CJ Stroud. I'm more of a pocket passer guy. I'm a traditionalist. Carson Palmer, in my opinion, is the best prospect of all time. So I very much like CJ Stroud. That said, I completely understood the draw of drafting Bryce Young first overall. They bring him into an offense that's trying to figure itself out despite having a ton of veteran coaches on the staff. They then fire that coach. Let me rewind. They sign possibly the best bridge quarterback you could possibly hire in Andy Dalton. a guy who could start several games and allow Bryce Young to learn the NFL, allow the offense to figure out the system, allow this like concoction of terribleness that was established be, presented with a veteran quarterback who knows the offense, who knows Josh McCown, who knows Frank Reich, who understands offenses, has seen everything. They chose not to do that. Instead, they subjected Bryce Young to week 1 and week 2. He looked mediocre at best. He gets injured. The severity of that injury, I think you could speculate on after week 3. Dalton goes out and has a pretty solid game. I think people are misremembering. It wasn't like the greatest performance ever. It wasn't exponentially better. Yeah, his passing yardage looked great, but they lost, and he was trying to get them back into the game. So then what do? The next week, they put Bryce Young back in. Bryce goes on a string of okay to mediocre games until they get to week 15. He looks great against the Green Bay Packers and hasn't thrown a touchdown since. But we got to rewind a little bit again. So Frank Reich's out. They've fired the head coach. They've shuffled offensive coordinators during his rookie season. They bring in a coach who hires an offensive staff that he is very familiar with. They're all on the same page. They all speak the same thing. They all speak the same language. Bryce gets all of the OTA starter reps. Then Andy Dalton gets hurt early in training camp. Bryce Young gets all the reps there. He starts to build. He starts to become a very good practice player throughout training camp. The last 2 weeks of training camp, he was really, really strong, playing against his own defense and then playing against the Jets. They don't play him in the preseason, even though it's a new system. I think the preseason argument's kind of a paper tiger, kind of a straw man, because he ends up playing a full game against the Saints and struggles mightily. Oh, so he's got more playing time than he ever would have gotten in the preseason, and then struggled mightily against the Chargers. Anyway, back up again. So he plays against a bunch of guys who probably are not on the Bills anymore. In the preseason finale, plays one drive, looks excellent. They put him out there against New Orleans. He's terrible. He doesn't complete a pass until they're already down by 17. So he's already playing from behind. He has trouble reading blitz pressure packages. He then claims that he has the ability to change certain things and has freedom. Dave Canales backs him. Then he comes in this Chargers game and looks somehow even worse. They've called a play calling adventure, as I would call it, where most of the reads were short yardage, trying to get his confidence up. Inevitably, it hurts him because the defense keys in on that, and he just basically gets plastered around the field with incompletions, hits, sacks. Like, it didn't work. He didn't work. And look, the sum of the parts is, as I ramble about this, is all mismanagement. There was literally no reason to start Bryce Young right away as a rookie. I said that when he was drafted. I said Andy Dalton was a perfect guy for that. They ignored it, rushed the guy out, just like a lot of teams do, and the hit rate on those guys typically isn't great. They've changed up his offense 3 separate times. They've asked him to do a bunch of stuff. Look, the physical inadequacies are very clear, and his performance has been terrible. You're drafted first overall. You're expected to uplift your teammates, not have your teammates uplift you all the time. But I think the thing that really sticks out to me here is 2 things can be true. The Panthers failed Bryce Young with how they've handled him over the last 18 months. Fact. That is a fact. Mm-hmm. You drafted him. You made him your guy. You pushed him out there. You put the immediate pressure on him when you didn't need to. You saw him struggle throughout the year. Then you doubled down by hiring a head coach who you thought could fix him because of his work with quarterbacks. He still fails, and then the onus is put on him. When the defense can't stop anyone, despite having all of these guys that are familiar with the system, they're running into each other. The punter's punting 6 times a game. The wide receivers are struggling to get yards after the catch. Like, the only thing that's really been fixed is the offensive line, which I think has performed very, very well over the last years.
Yeah.
The running game is playing as well as you and I have talked about. I thought the running game would be a strength of this team. Dave Canales thought that too. And then you're going back on Bryce Young. Yes. Two things can be true. The Panthers failed Bryce Young, but Bryce Young failed to operate in this offense. And when you fail to operate as a quarterback at the magnitude that he did, you can't evaluate anyone. You can't evaluate Xavier Legette. You can't evaluate Jonathan Mingo. You can't evaluate Tommy Tremble. You can't, with no hope for getting points, you can't evaluate the defense. The defense has very little margin for error. Special teams has very little margin for error. Getting a kickoff and returning it to the 20 is going to be seen as a negative because they can't pick up yardage on offense because the quarterback can't throw.
Yep.
I think this benching was necessary. I thought it would originally be – I thought he was going to get this week. I truly thought he was going to get this week. I thought week 4 through 6 were the times to pull the plug if you needed to, because you spent the entire offseason building around this guy. Think about how many wasted reps that is in turn. And they're trying to build a culture. The reason why I'm okay with this benching is I'll read this quote from Adam Thielen. Adam Thielen had kind of a tirade in the middle of the 26-3 loss against the Chargers. He was wide open. Instead, Bryce Young took a sack. He started screaming to himself on the sideline and pacing. We asked him about it. He admitted to it. He said it was immature. I asked him how he keeps Bryce Young from being discouraged. He says, I think number one, I went over and I apologized to him because it wasn't, again, directed at anyone. But when you do that, it feels probably like it's directed at someone. I don't know how he felt about it, but again, take accountability. I apologize. I can't do that. I can't let my cool down. We talk through games. We talk during the week. He's a great kid. I love that guy, and I'm fighting for him. I'm fighting for all my teammates. Again, when you put so much into this game, and I know that I don't have a lot of time left, you feel that, and you put it all out there every single day in practice, in games. You just want to see some results as an offense, as a team, because I know these guys. We fought together. We have the guys. We just have to figure it out. And a few things strike me there. This team is actually one of the older teams in the league because of the contracts they've held on to. The specialists are both older. Adams, obviously older. Dalton's older, all that stuff. When he's saying he puts a lot into the game, which he does, we know he works really hard. There's guys like Jordan Matthews who work really hard to be here, all that stuff. You can't look at a locker room as a head coach and say, look, there's this very clear weakness here. I'm trying to build a culture here, and I'm just going to continue to give him the scholarship. The scholarship is gone. That's what this all means. Doesn't mean we won't see Bryce Young again. Doesn't mean that Bryce Young should be traded, although it wouldn't shock me if those close to him thought he should be traded because of the way this was kind of sprung. I'm not reporting that. That's just speculation. I want to make that very clear. But, that's normally how a lot of these situations end. But we also haven't seen a situation like this where our first overall pick was benched after 18 games. I mean, Jamarcus Russell was rough, but he got his time. Like, this is tough.
So Mike, this kind of dovetails into my question for you that's coming up. We're talking about this like there's some finality to it. I think some fans are still out there thinking, okay, well, this is a time when Bryce can learn from the sideline where, yes, this might be belated, but this could be Andy's time to be that bridge quarterback for Bryce. And he can learn and he can eventually grow into he can get his confidence back and he eventually can grow into this creative passer. And I see how you're already kind of moving. I am curious to hear your thoughts. Is this just a stepping stone in the Bryce Young story, or is there a legitimate finality to this? Like, I know we asked Dave Canales yesterday, or you did specifically, if Andy's just going to be the starter going forward, or is there like a timeline to when they want Bryce to get back into the season? Is Bryce going to start again? And he very much stuck to the company line of Andy gives us the best chance to win right now. That all said, is this a final point in the Bryce Young Carolina Panthers story?
I could see how Dave Canales could see this as being a positive for Bryce, as he basically worked with the two guys who have, in recent memory, who have overcome being benched as a high pick or a starting quarterback in their very early youth in the NFL, and Baker Mayfield and Geno Smith, and turning it around and doing that stuff. But to be honest, like, I don't know how you look at the situation with rose-colored glasses. As you said, what Robert Hunt said, it's hard to gain your confidence back. His physical shortcomings are not going away. The thing is, when you're a backup quarterback, you're playing with the scout team, and that's your practice reps. So you're studying other quarterbacks and trying to mimic what they do and mimic other systems. And maybe, you know what? Maybe that extra flavor will help him, as I wrote in my mailbag today. But it's hard to take a positive spin on this. This is an organizational failure, like to the umph degree. And I don't know, man. I just think there's so much pressure put on these quarterbacks early, and a lot of them are rushed out there. Some sink, some swim. But I think when you prolong the amount of time that they have to tread water in garbage water, it just makes it worse. Like, had they benched him mid-year last year, maybe it would have been more salvageable, or maybe if they would have started the season and said, you know what, we're going to make Bryce earn it, and Andy was the starter for 3 weeks, then I'd get it. But like pulling the curtain this quickly and doing this, like, I understand you have to worry about the locker room. You can't just worry about one player. And look, to their credit, this was a brave move by this brain trust. This took a lot of courage. They knew they were going to get slammed. They knew that they had to make a decision. They knew they couldn't lose the locker room, which I think is an asinine term in general, because no one ever fully loses everybody in a locker room. Everybody has their own priorities and stuff like that. But this early in Dave Canales' tenure, as he's trying to establish his culture with Brad Idzik, with Ejiro Evero, with Scott Cooper, with Dan Morgan at the helm, like, they had to make some tough decisions. And I know a lot of people are jumping to, this has Tepper written all over it. I mean, it's a major decision, right?
Yeah,
and look, to be fair, this puts egg on David Tepper's face. David Tepper wanted Bryce Young. There's no like, nothing happens this big without an owner signing off, whether it's the Panthers, whether it's the Eagles, whether it's, well, maybe not the White Sox, but you know what I'm saying?
No,
like,
why you gotta do that?
But like, here's the thing, like, an owner, like, at some point you have to be able to establish what Dave Canales can do. And Bryce Young clearly couldn't do what Dave Canales was asking him to do, whether that was his fault or Dave Canales' fault. And so they had to have a very serious conversation. Like, this is something that, like, look, Dave Canales the day before said that Bryce was our quarterback. He has to live with the fact that publicly he looks like he contradicted himself. The whole I went home and had an epiphany thing, sounds like a really good line, I guess, internally. But, like, to me, that's a bigger decision to make than, I watched the tape and, this didn't work. I mean, last week we clearly saw it didn't work, right? And then he comes into here and he somehow plays worse. I just think this failure is not totally on Dave Canales. This is a failure that's brewed over 18 months. I think Dave Canales, based on the play calling I saw in training camp, can have an effective offense. We'll see if that works with Andy Dalton.
Mike you and I talked about this off air after the game, or after Los Angeles. We were like, if Dave does this, he is changing the rubric on how he's graded in his first year, because how he's graded in his first year was largely about how good Bryce Young could be. It wasn't about team success necessarily. It wasn't about offensive success as a whole. A lot of it was how Bryce Young was doing. So he's changing the rubric. And now it's like a bigger gamble than I think most people consider. So that's why I think this is so surprising. Anyway, do you have anything to add on that? I mean, I kind of rambled for a second.
Yeah, I always like to bring up the quote, people will remember how you make them feel, right?
Yep.
And this organization has done a really good job of establishing this isn't all about Bryce, but also saying there are no expectations. And so I think when you go into a season like that and then immediately say Bryce is the problem, that is what benching him is. I'm sorry, that is what you are saying with your actions. It concerns me that words might not have meaning. And as two writers, we know that not to be true.
Yep.
But for a coach, you want to make sure that your words mean something. And so while I think there will be some guys in the locker room who are going to be excited to get a pass beyond 17 yards, I also think there are people that have been around Bryce for a while and who believe in his strength and potentially his upside that are going to say, well, what's next, right? And so you don't want to see a snowball. If they go to Las Vegas and get trucked and Andy, yeah, he looks more confident, but they're just, inept, like, what then, right?
Well, I think a lot of Panthers fans will respond by saying, okay, that's fine. Let's cut our losses, move on to a good draft position in the coming year and try to rebuild from there. And I don't agree with it, man. It's you're 2 weeks into the year. You got to find a way to make the season salvageable one way or the other.
The season isn't salvageable. It isn't. I'm sorry. It's not. There's
not salvageable using the metrics of playoffs.
No,
you got to find a way to improve.
Let me ask you this. What does winning 5 or 6 games with Andy Dalton truly do other than keep the locker room intact? What does it truly do? Here's what I'm asking. The one way that this is salvageable is if the offense looks explosive under Dave Canales, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what's salvageable. You winning with a 36-year-old quarterback, what does that do for the future other than establish that you are a good play caller? If that's the goal, if that's now the goal, if that's the whole goal of the season, because the defense can't figure anything out, despite having a tenured defensive coordinator and a bunch of familiar faces. If that's what you are saying, fine, cool. That's the positive. But I also think it's moving the goalpost. I really do. I think it's moving the goalpost.
It certainly is.
It's par for the course with this franchise. And look, I'm trying to stay objective here, but realistically, there's a reason why fans are so impatient. It's because the goalposts always move, and decisions that would normally be seen as rational seem to not pan out for one reason or another because goalposts are moving. This is not a Dan Morgan problem. This is not a Dave Canales problem. This is a problem that's happened for the last several years under David Tepper's ownership, whether he is the root cause of all of that, whatever. But the reality of the situation is his ownership tenure has not panned out very well.
Yeah.
Largely because the goalposts move all the time.
Bro,
whether he's involved or not.
I just can't imagine you spend so much money, not even to be a PSL owner. You spend so much money to be one of a half-filled stadium, a Bank of America Stadium. It's a gorgeous day. You're spending $30 on nachos, $10 on a beer. You figure out ways to pay for $50 worth of parking in Uptown. And I cannot imagine you have fun watching the Panthers on Sunday.
Definitely not looking at your receipts on your
in that Chargers game. Well, I'm just saying, there's got to be a way to not constantly balance the future with to not constantly how you say the present has to be tolerable. It just does. That's what or else you risk losing your fan base. You risk losing your support. And yeah, sure, they'll come back when the future is good, but that's not how it works. The present has to be tolerable. That's all I'm saying. This is not going to be the last that we talk about the Bryce Young dilemma. This is not going to be the last time we talk about if Andy Dalton is going to be the guy of the future. But I think we hammered it pretty home for a first crack at the bat.
Yeah,
Bryce
why don't you? There was a lot less humor in this episode, and I'm sorry because we went double like the normal time. I'll make it up to you guys. I'm sick, so I'm in somewhat of a rough mood.
Well, no,
Look,
I mean we had a lot to get through. I feel like people will find the humor. I mean, we did low-key kind of fight in the middle too.
that
So
wasn't. Yeah, that the passion was all about you and me, like us getting into an argument. I mean, I think look, you and I cover this team as objectively as possible. We watch all this stuff. At the end of the day, we're just watching this, right?
Mhm.
Like we're watching this thing go down the tracks.
Well,
And
we're more than watching. We're in the locker room with these guys. We're hearing
right,
stories. We're having conversations that the public doesn't see and stuff like that.
right, but we are spectators. And the fans are who this matters to, right? And
Yeah.
I think part of the reason why I infuse so much humor in my writing, why you put so much character into yours, is because look, we know we're watching the same thing you are. This is rough, and I think you guys sticking with us and reading our content and listening to our content and doing all that stuff matters a lot to us.
Oh my God. Yeah.
And we really appreciate being in your ears right now. And we hope you stick with us throughout the season because we're going to be around for a while. So on that note, Alex,
Thanks as always for listening to our pontifications on all things Panthers with Mike Kaye and myself and our wonderful producer, Zach Dennis. Please subscribe and follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts by searching Processing Blue. And if you watch us on YouTube, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and click on the bell icon to get notified whenever new episodes drop. And finally, please be sure to stick to charlotteobserver.com for all your Panthers needs. Stay humble, stay creative, and keep processing.
that's a wrap.